Hi, everyone. Absolutely lovely to see you here. And it gives me great pleasure to bring this event to you a second time. We started last year on behalf of the History Department at the University of Manchester and Creative Manchester. And you've just heard about the 200 years of the university, and what a great occasion to have you all here and talk about doing history as a discipline. If not in Manchester, then somewhere else, but we always live in hope. So my name is Anindita Ghosh. I'm a professor of modern Indian history at the University of Manchester, and I'm also head of department currently. So we like to bring this event to you every year. We hope that we catch you at the right time before you're making your choices, and about hoping that you will understand through this event, a little I hope, the importance of history, and particularly the importance of history for the world we live in today and for our identity politics. So we are absolutely grateful to have Professor David Olusoga collaborating with us every year for this event and bringing that very important message to you. I won't be talking for much because the order of the events is like this. I give you a brief introduction to history at Manchester. Then we have one of our students, Destiny Reynolds, who's here to speak to you about her experience of being at the University of Manchester History Department. And then, of course, the moment that you've all been waiting for, to hear Professor David Olusoga, who's a professor of public history with us, and we are very grateful to have him as a colleague in the department. So to start off with, if you could have the next slide, please. So who are we? What do we do? And what we do, does that matter? Who we are is we are a very big body in the department, about 50 plus staff. And we teach a very diverse history ranging across the globe, not just Europe and North America and Britain, but also Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and some parts of the Middle East. So this is the kind of history that we aim to deliver, and we hope that our students really enjoy. You will shortly hear from Destiny, so I shan't speak on her behalf. But what we do, does that matter? I think it does. We all believe it does, because it helps you understand the world that you live in today. All these news flashing at you from the screen, from the various social media websites. I suppose you get them from mostly these days, young people, am I right? Probably. Okay, and newspapers, of course. You know, how do you make sense of that? How do you interact with that? You know, what do you make of this complex world that we live in? If not anything, if not just a passion for the subject, which of course we hope we are able to deliver, I hope it helps you to better understand the world that you live in today. And the next slide. Right. At this point, I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we live in a world where worldviews are very different for all of us. We don't share exactly the same point of view with the person sitting next to us about the world today. You just have to turn and talk to the person next to you to find out what they make of the world and Britain today, and probably won't have exactly the same idea. So this is a very key question that David will address today, and something that we are constantly grappling with within the discipline, and what we also very much bring to the fore in our teaching in the department. So that this is the question about the history that we share, whether it's also tied to identity, therefore, which makes us perceive history in a different way. So we look at history in a different way because of who we are. This is why we have the very different viewpoints. And central to that is, of course, the decolonizing of the curriculum as a movement that's gone on for a while across UK and also in the department. I'm very proud to say that we have embraced decolonization in the history department in a very big way. And we are very glad that we have colleagues working on this constantly. Our work is not finished, by no means am I saying that we've done with it, but we've embraced it, and we are working on it. And the next one. And I'll just rapidly take you through 2 slides. This is not a history lesson, 2 to 3 slides. And just to help you to understand what I'm saying as I say that there are different histories for everyone, because you might think, well, of course, facts and figures are the same. How do we change that? And I'll take you rapidly through a few images to help you understand for yourself what these different histories are, what these different viewpoints could be. So the first one is a picture on the ceiling of the East India House. So I'm talking about the East India Company, relating, of course, to the British Empire. And you can see there a picture of Britannia receiving gifts from the Orient and from Africa. And the next one. And this is the East India Company building as it's visualized for the 18th century as it looked like then. And the next one. And here you have very different images. You have one of Britain and France carving up the world, and that's obviously a cartoon there you can see. And then you have a very graphic illustration of the transportation of slaves across the Atlantic. Now, if you were to think of the British Empire, you have a choice as to which images you want to stick with and which images you want to discard from your imagination. When I say discard, I don't mean just discard, but critically discard from your imagination. So this is what I mean by choice, and this is what I mean by differing viewpoints. But as I said, this is not a history lesson, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But just to give you a snapshot of the kind of things that the discipline can do for you. And the next. To give you an example of some of the courses that we do in the history department, we have examples of some of these here. So there's a level 1 course called Manchester History Workshop, which showcases the hands-on work of history with a focus on part of the slides blocked out for some reasons not visible. But it's basically about migration and race and the people who shaped the city of Manchester. It's a very small bespoke course, 30-35 students. Students absolutely enjoy it because it's very hands-on. It's about going to the archives and interviewing people and oral histories and all of that. And level 2, we do colonial encounters, race, violence, and the making of a modern world. This, as the title, doesn't leave you with anything very hard to digest. That's critically looking at empire and colonialism and slavery. But that's pretty much what it does. That's a level 2 course. And then the next slide, please. So these are examples of just 2 of the kind of courses which represent decolonization and diversification in the discipline that we teach at level 3. These are very intense courses spread across a semester, 3 hours every week, seminar-style classes. And these are just two of the examples of the kind of courses that address decolonization in the department. The Black Freedom Movement, 1955 to 1975, is taught by Dr. Kerry Pimblett, and a Black Britain, Power Neighborhoods and the Everyday, 1948 to 1990, taught by Dr. Jack Webb. The second one involves a lot of visits. I don't know whether Destiny is interested hearing this to take this up for her level 3 choices. And the next one. This is the last slide I have. I just wanted to draw your attention to this one because it's kind of making a leap from the history textbooks and journal articles and the monographs that you would be reading to the world that we live in today, because that is such a live connection. And I wanted to bring this up. I'm sure you recognize the image. I don't need to tell you about it, but that's a removal of the Colston statue in Bristol, David's hometown. He's spoken very publicly about this whole incident. To say that, it's not a dead subject, it's not about the past. Strangely, it is actually about the present that we live in. So it's a very live discipline, and this is why I wanted to kind of bring to you the importance of public history and the importance of studying history. Therefore, right, I finished my introduction there, but I will be handing over to Destiny Reynolds, who's a level 2 student, but also to say that after this, we would be handing over directly to Professor Olusoga, who I know he needs no introduction. I say this every time, he needs no introduction, but it somehow doesn't seem right if I don't introduce him. So he's a professor of public history at the University of Manchester. He's very, very well-known historian, broadcaster, public personality, and he is, some of his works, I'm sure you've seen some of them. I like to do this every time. How many of you have read his books? That's really good. I hope, David, you're noting that. and of course, the TV series, I'm sure all hands will go up if you've, yeah, great, wonderful. So you know who he is in terms of the books he's written and in terms of the TV work that he's done. I just also wanted to add there that the one apart from Black and British, Forgotten Slave Owners, The World's War and all of that, the one I most recently enjoyed was The Union with David Olusoga, which I think really brought to light the very complex history of this union of the United Kingdom. In 2019, he was awarded an OBE for services to history and community integration. So without further ado, over to Destinie and then over to David.
Hi everyone. So as previously mentioned, my name's Destinie. I'm a second year student studying history and Spanish at the University of Manchester. So when I think back to it, it feels so bizarre that I'm here talking about how much I love history. I remember when it was time to submit my UCAS application, everyone had an opinion about me wanting to study history, both good and bad. So my department at my sixth form was over the moon that I wanted to take history, but I very quickly realised that there's a massive stereotype around history as a degree. People seem to think it's easy or pointless, but as I'll explain, history is a discipline and as a degree is central to making practical changes to the society that we live in. So my background's in activism. I got politically active during the Black Lives Matter movement, and I've been active in various movements since. And this has massively influenced what history that I choose to research, how I want my work to be used in the wider world, and it also contributes to how I intervene within different specific historical narratives on the topics that I'm researching. When it was time to choose what university I wanted to go to, I looked at all the different modules across the history courses at various universities across the country, and Manchester definitely stood out. What was really important to me was having various modules accessible and available to me, which should ensure that I was able to study the type of history that I actually wanted to do. And in my experience so far, Manchester has exceeded all of my expectations. As previously mentioned, the modules have been so inspiring and the teaching staff are genuinely supportive and not superficially. Like, if you're interested in something, they do go the extra mile to make sure your interests and needs are met. So over my 2 years, I've taken loads of really enjoyable modules. So one of the level 2 modules I recently took was called From Jamestown to James Brown, and it gave a really comprehensive analysis of the lives of Black Americans from slavery to the present day, so it went right up until 2020, George Floyd's murder. As previously mentioned, the Colonial Encounters module was great. It looked at Britain's intervention in India and Africa, which shaped contemporary narratives around former colonies. And these are just 2 of the many history modules that I've taken that have developed both my historical skills, but also my joy for learning. Again, as mentioned before, last year I took the Manchester Migration Stories module, which was mentioned just then, and that's what truly made me fall in love with history. The module explored the hidden histories of minority communities here in Manchester, the African and Caribbean, Jewish, LGBTQ+, and Eastern European communities, just to name a few. And after the initial sessions on each community's nuanced history, we were tasked with creating educational resources on a topic of our choice to send to local schools, which we then presented in our class as the final assessment. Once the module was finished, I contacted the course convener, Dr. Kerry Pimblott, to ensure that the students who were willing to contribute their work could get them into schools. And I think what's really notable that the work that we were, or the research we were carrying out was genuinely grassroots historical research that was then pushed further into to a wider audience, into local schools. And over this year, I was the student lead on this project, and we're in the final stages of getting these resources prepared for local schools, which is really exciting, and it just speaks to the opportunities that you can find within the history department. As part of this module, I chose to focus on Caribbean migration to Manchester post-Windrush, looking specifically at the community's role in the 1981 uprisings in Moss Side. And not only did this project allow me to unlock this hidden working class history, which has been sidelined from the dominant mainstream media narratives, but it also allowed me to find my niche, which is now race in modern Britain. More specifically, I look at how the black community resisted in inner city Britain in the 20th and 21st century. The passion that I developed through this project really opened my eyes to the opportunities within academia and the really important historical work that needs to be done on this topic through the lens of community engagement. After completing this module, because it made me love history so much, I applied for an internship at the Institute of Historical Research, which is based in London at SOAS. And I worked on a project called The Windrush Scandal in its national and Commonwealth contexts. And this was such a cool opportunity. I got to work with really cool scholars in London, but I also had the support of my lecturers here in Manchester. It was a great opportunity and really developed my passion for history and pushed me towards continuing my own research on modern Britain, independent of the modules that I take through my degree. I've just finished my independent research project, which is like a mini dissertation, which all history students in level 2 complete. I looked at how space was used as a site of resistance in Moss Side between 1969 and 1981. Obviously, it's a very niche topic, and I was able to choose it myself. So you do get that freedom in year 2 and year 3 with your dissertation if you choose to do one. Through this project, I worked really closely with some of my lecturers, and then I got the opportunity to present my findings to the faculty at the Race Roots Resistance Collective's annual conference last month, which again was a great opportunity to help me with my presenting skills, but also express this really important research to a wider audience. With support of the scholars at the university researching similar topics around race in Britain, I've been able to truly ingrain myself into Moss Side's community, and I'm starting to unveil these hidden narratives that we don't commonly see in the mainstream media. Because I do Spanish, I'm going on a year abroad next year, but once I'm back, I'm really looking forward to continuing my research on Moss Side, to continue unearthing the marginalised voices of the community and authentically centering them in the historical discourse. And this is just one of several projects that I've worked on this year. So I'm just going to talk about a couple more things that the School of Arts, Languages and Cultures, which the History Department falls under, does. So this year I was part of the Undergraduate Scholars Programme, which is an annual programme run by SALC here at Manchester. I carried out research on 19th century women's radical activism in the US for a scholar at the university who's writing a book on the revolutionary anarchist Louise Michel. Since completing the programme, I've now started working more closely with my project supervisor as a research assistant for her upcoming book, Louise Michel in America. I'm also an emerging scholar on a project funded by the University of Manchester with the Royal Exchange Theatre, which is going to further develop some of the recent studies on Manchester's links with the transatlantic slave trade. And again, this is just a couple of the many research opportunities that you can get through the history department. Just kind of wrapping up, I wanted to talk about being a black student at the University of Manchester, and especially in the history department. Navigating humanities can be really challenging, but there are several provisions made available to support us during our degrees, as well as support from our lecturers, the student support services, the campus wellbeing sites. We also have the Manchester 1010 programme, which offers mentorship, career opportunities, and training for all black students on campus, so it's not specific to history. and I've been using them since I started uni, and it's been a really useful tool for me to develop my skills and also feel more comfortable and more comfortable on campus. At one of their most recent networking events, I got to meet Olusoga, who was one of the candidates on the most recent season of the BBC's Apprentice. We connected over my work on Moss Side, and now she's my mentor. So it just really shows there are so many unexpected opportunities here in Manchester, but also history can connect you with people in various different ways. I've spoken about how broad the opportunities are for studying history at the University of Manchester, and I'm so happy that I've been able to receive so many insane opportunities, which is in part due to the academic guidance and support from the staff here that have pushed, developed, and championed me in my work. So for anyone who is considering doing a history degree, please, please, please do it. It's so good. I really enjoy it, honestly. And I've kind of made it clear that I kind of do want to go into academia once I finish my degree, but I also know that loads of history graduates that have gone into various careers like journalism, accounting, law, film production, and so much more. But just to really wrap up now, my inspiration for taking this degree is encapsulated by this quote by Eric Williams, who once said, "In understanding the past, we gain insight into the present and can shape a brighter future." And I truly believe that the discipline of history will help us build this brighter future. So I hope it inspires you all as much as it motivates me. And I'm now going to pass on to David Olusoga. So thank you.
Hi there, is the mic working? Can you hear me? Yeah, great, that's fantastic. Thank you for coming. It's lovely to be back here. So I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes. Then we've got about 30 minutes for questions. And I want to pick up on a lot of the themes that have been mentioned by Anindita and by Destinie. The title is Making History in the Age of Black Lives Matter. And I want us to sort of go back to that moment 4 years ago. For many of you were very young back then. And just note one particular detail about that remarkable period. Because Black Lives Matter began as a protest against contemporary police violence. Obviously, after the murder of George Floyd. But almost instantly, almost immediately, it became a debate about history. It became a discussion about what was taught and what was not taught at schools. It became a debate about statues. Very quickly, history almost in some ways, in some places, took over the debates that Black Lives Matter raised. As Anindita said, I live in Bristol. The biggest event, not just in Bristol, but in Britain of that summer, was the toppling of a statue of a man who died in 1729, 300 years earlier. History and Black Lives Matter kind of fused, and I think there's reasons for that. Because those events took place in a broader moment, I think a generational moment, when nations all over the world are beginning to engage in a reckoning with their past. And decolonization that Anindita mentioned, the widening of viewpoints and the range of voices is part of that reckoning, that moment. But history is not just taking place within universities. If you were to study history, as Anindita and myself would very much like you to, and if you're interested in the courses mentioned on empire and on race, then you will very quickly find yourself engaged in a form of history that is public history, unavoidably public history. Because those histories of empire and race, they are front page news. Statues, not just here, but all over the world, are falling and have fallen. Organizations, universities, banks, charities are researching their past, their links to historic slavery, their links to empire. Some of them are engaging in forms of restorative justice. The Church of England, Lloyd's of London, the Guardian newspaper, the Manchester Guardian that I work for, all engaged in reckoning with their pasts and making amends. this is all so immediate that let's just take the past couple of days. Yesterday, Turkey declared its support for Greece on the return of the so-called Elgin marbles, better known as the Parthenon marbles, or should be better known as the Parthenon marbles. And Turkey, very deliberately, very purposefully, in its statement, described the British Empire as the colonists. It's, as someone who writes in this, I've managed to go, I think, 4 days since I was last mentioned in the newspaper for my comments about the British Empire. This is public history. This is a public debate. This is a big age of reckoning, and there's also a backlash. There's also those who would seek to exploit, to use this moment for electoral gain and, of course, for monetization. And what they will tell you is that this reckoning with our past, this decolonization, is a form of rewriting history. Well, there's two problems with that approach. First is that rewriting history is almost a job description of what historians do. But also, what's happening, the reason why these histories are so exciting, so dynamic, so public, is because what they are reckoning with is the way people were already written out of history. History arrives in our lives already rewritten, already edited. And black history, as a part of imperial history, has been one of the most obvious areas where voices have been lost, where communities have been marginalized. And I wanted to start with an example that shows us that being done, but most importantly shows us the mechanisms by which certain people and certain voices are edited out, not just of the work that historians do, but actually out of the raw materials historians use to tell history. In the first decades of the 21st century, this debate about black history and about empire is being debated because the process by which people are edited out of the past is as poorly understood as the results of that editing. The story I want to tell you begins in 1944. Ironically, it's in the lead up to the event that we're celebrating this week, D-Day. In 1944, the beginning of the year, General de Gaulle, who was the leader of the Free French Forces, that was the part of the French army that had not been captured by the Germans in the invasion in 1940, but had retreated to the French Empire and fought around the world. De Gaulle was debating with his allies, the British and the French, how, when the war ended, and most importantly, when the French capital Paris was liberated after 4 years of occupation, what role the Free French Army was going to play in that historic moment. And in 1944, at the beginning of the year, the American general, Bedell Smith, who was the chief of staff to the supreme Allied commander of the whole force that was going to invade Europe at D-Day, General Eisenhower, the American general, they were engaged in negotiations about which units of the Free French Army, the parts that had fought beyond France in the war, that had been supplied and trained by the Allies, which part of that army was going to be allowed to lead the Allied forces into Paris. Because everyone understood it was incredibly important symbolically that when the newsreels captured the pictures of the liberation of Paris, that it was absolutely vital symbolically that the army leading the Allied forces into Paris was a French army, that the French were seen to be leading the liberation of their own capital city. Everybody understood the symbolism, the poignancy, and those images that would be caught on the cameras would be imprinted onto the historical record. They would be one of those events that we would never forget. Those images would be, like, in effect, eternal. In a confidential letter in January 1944, the General Bedell Smith wrote this. He said, "It is most desirable that this division, the unit that was to liberate Paris, consists of white personnel." And he suggested that the 2nd Armoured Division of the Free French Forces, which he described as being only 1/4 native personnel, i.e. not white Europeans, be the regiment that was chosen. 3/4 of the soldiers of the 2nd Armoured Division were not white. But in Bedell Smith's view, the fact that 1/4 of them were black and North African and West African meant that they had the potential of becoming the right unit. They weren't there yet, but they had the potential. He said that they were the only French division operationally available that could be made, keyword is made, 100% white. So this is an American general talking about a French army and wanting this army for this symbolic moment to be 100% white. And what he meant by that is that it would be possible to take this division, take all of the North African, all of the West African, all of the Central African black soldiers out of that unit and replace them with white soldiers taken from other units of the Free French Army. What he meant was, let's create a division, a unit of this army that had never really existed. They'd never fought together. They weren't part of the same regiment. They were going to be created. It was artificial. In another letter, 14th of January, 2 weeks later, the British General, Frederick Morgan, wrote a report on the meetings that he was then having with the French. And he wrote, and he explained to the French, that only with reluctance would the British accept anything other than French metropolitan troops. Metropolitan is a code word for white. He then went on to explain to the French representatives that his chance, the French's chance of getting what they wanted, i.e. a French division to lead the liberation of Paris, would be vastly improved if they would produce a white infantry division. These secret negotiations between the Americans, the British and the French at the highest levels are recorded in documents that no one at the time got to see. But those negotiations, those secret discussions behind the scenes, behind closed doors, ensured that when Paris was liberated, the French army that marched through the streets was the 2nd Armoured Division. But that division, the 25% who were not white, they'd been removed. The details of how they'd been removed vary enormously. They were restricted to their barracks, locked in their barracks. They had their uniforms taken from them. And white soldiers from other units were added to the 2nd Armoured Division. They actually couldn't find enough white soldiers, so they went around the other units and found North African soldiers who they felt looked white enough to pass as white. Now, the Free French Army that fought, that suffered, that died during the Second World War was 60% African and West African and North African. The unit that was created to liberate Paris was a fake unit that made those 60% who had fought throughout the war invisible. This was a moment when the film cameras were recording. This was a moment in which their involvement, their contribution, their suffering, and of course the deaths of many of their compatriots could have been stamped permanently onto the historical record. And it was because of that, it was because this was a moment when the contribution of non-white people would be recorded, would be celebrated, could never then be denied or brushed under the carpet or airbrushed out. It's because it was a moment that was going to be part of history and everyone could see it coming, that efforts were made by 3 powers, the United States and 2 colonial powers, let us not forget, to ensure that black people were erased from that historical record. And all we are left with are the conspiratorial letters of the generals involved. If you go onto YouTube and look at the Pathé film, the Gaumont film, the American newsreel footage of the liberation of Paris, you will see the 2nd Armoured Division. What you will not see are the 60% of the Free French Army who were North Africans and West Africans. And this was at the end, or coming to the end, of a war against the Nazi racial state, against the ideology of the Übermensch and the Untermensch, of the Herren race. This was a war in which this nation, the UK and France and the United States, were on the side of the angels. And yet these decisions, made at the time, are decisions that we're still living with the consequences of. We still have to write books and make television programs to remind ourselves that there were non-white people, men and women, who laboured in factories, who worked on ships and who fought on the front lines of both the Second and the First World War. We have to engage in this act of recovery because of the act of erasure carried out 70 years ago. So the act of decolonization is not just recovering lost voices and lost stories and marginalized communities. It's also recovering the processes and finding the moments and identifying the guilty men who were involved in the act of erasure in the first place. That is as much decolonization as recovering the voices, asking ourselves not just why, but how. How did our history become so deracinated, so full of holes and half-truths and missing chapters? When I was growing up, I became interested in history, not in any way to study these missing chapters and these marginalized voices. I was interested in history because I grew up in the 80s and British society was just saturated with the Second World War. I wasn't interested in history in general, I was just interested in the Second World War because it was everywhere. Half the toys in a much more gendered world for boys were Second World War toys. There were plastic soldiers and action men. Half the films on television were war films. There were magazines that boys bought that were just stories from the Second World War. It was everywhere, and all of the old men, all of my grandfather's friends had fought in the Second World War, and I was determined for them to tell me their stories. And nothing in anything that I read, none of the books at school, none of the lessons at school, none of the war films, none of the magazines, none of the toys, for a second led me to believe or even suspect for a moment that that war had not been conducted entirely by white Europeans. I understood the enemy had been the Japanese Empire, but other than that, the war was a white conflict. A few years ago, I was making a program, and in a special and a website, a sort of a military website, I was trying to find some of the ephemera, some of the toys and things that I had as a kid. And I found a box of plastic soldiers that I had when I was about 8. They were the British 8th Army. And the picture on the cover shows a group of white soldiers. And that was entirely the image of the Second World War presented to me by everything I ever encountered. And then one day my mother pointed out to me, my mother was white and British, that Nigerians, my father's Nigerian, had fought in that war. And I almost didn't believe her. Because the effect of erasure, stories like the one I've just told you about the liberation of Paris, had been so complete that it seemed ridiculous that Africans had fought in the Second World War. A couple of years ago, I was in the archives of the Imperial War Museum looking at their collection of photographs of the 8th Army. The 8th Army depicted on the box of plastic soldiers I had as a child. That army was one of the most diverse armies ever created. It was made up of the South African Native Military Corps, soldiers from Swaziland, Madagascar, Senegal, Nigeria, Cyprus. All of that had been airbrushed out. All of that had been lost. We need, as I said, not just to recover those voices, but to ask ourselves why the process and how the process of erasure took place in the first place. But I think we need to do more. If we're going to study empire, if we're going to study slavery, if we're going to study exactly those areas that have been marginalized, we need to develop, I think, multiple lenses through which to view this history. One of the traps of a decolonized way of viewing the world, one of the habits we've got into, which I think we largely picked up because we had to learn the methodology of this history from the Americans, from the centuries now of African American scholarship, of African Americans trying to recover their history from the 1870s onwards. One of the bad habits that we've picked up is to focus history and believe history can be captured within this word contribution. Now, I've used the word contribution here today. I think we're getting more interference. I've used the word contribution here today, and I'm not saying one form of history is right and one form of history is wrong. I'm saying the idea of contribution cannot capture everything we need to do. It's absolutely valid that we remember that there were black soldiers in the Second World War and the First World War, that it was women from the Caribbean and Africa and men and women from India who built the NHS after the Second World War, that there were black sailors at Trafalgar. The problem is that form of contribution-based history misses out something absolutely vital. It misses out what it was that those communities were struggling against for all of those years, and the methodology, the motivation for their erasure. because it misses out race. It talks about people overcoming race, and it can make us feel good, both as members of minority communities and as people in general, British people, who want to feel the best about our country. It shows stories of people managing, despite race, to get somewhere in life, to record their voices, to stamp themselves on the historical record. But it doesn't want to talk about race. And we need to. We need to become better at doing that. I was in America earlier this week, and I was giving a lecture about an area of history that I think it's what I call applied history. It's where we can't understand what's happening to our world unless we understand the history of ideas. It's a form of history that involves historians working with people in other disciplines, in this case, in the medical sciences. It's about a form of racism, a form of racial stereotypes that aren't to do with behaviors. I think we all know the stereotypes, the false claims, the libels against people from various ethnic groups about the way they're supposed to behave. But there are also stereotypes that come out of history, that emerge from slavery, that emerge from the pseudoscience around slavery and around imperialism, that are about people's bodies. Numerous studies in the United States, but also here in Europe, have regularly revealed something really shocking about our world right now in the 21st century, which is that people of African descent, black people, are regularly underprescribed pain relief in hospitals. Their pain is underrated compared to that of white people by doctors. Remember, the doctors who are doing this don't know they're doing this. They're not doing it intentionally, but the result is there. Black patients have been recorded of having their pain underrated, not just relative to white patients, but relative to the WHO, World Health Organization guidelines. Black people today receive lower pain relief below the WHO guidelines, and today, in 2024, there are black people who are less likely to receive analgesics, even for fractures, for broken bones, and even when they report similar levels of pain to doctors. And this also applies to black children, whose pain is similarly underrated when they present at hospitals. The ideas that account for this are so ingrained within society that black people themselves have come to believe them. They've come in multiple studies to underrate their own pain relative to that of white people. Now, this is a real-world, 21st century, 2024 phenomenon that is recorded and well known and well documented and well studied. The question for historians is why? Where did these ideas come from? What are the underlying ideas that explain this? Because remember, doctors are the best people in our societies. These are people who have chosen to dedicate themselves to relieving suffering. And what the research shows is the doctors doing this don't know they're doing it. They're doing it because of old ideas, really old ideas, really powerful ideas that come to our society from exactly the histories that we, for centuries, have marginalized and pushed to the margins, pushed to the sides, slavery and empire. These ideas were invented in the age of slavery, and we, as historians, can help clinicians who want to combat these ideas, who want to train doctors to spot the dangers of these ideas by tracing the DNA of this form of thinking. They come from a mindset, from an idea invented by slave owners and slave traders, by their supporters, by slave ship surgeons, by plantation doctors, that put forward the idea that black people feel pain less than white people. It's a ridiculous idea. It's medically disproved. And yet, people are operating. People are carrying out actions according to those ideas, influenced by those ideas in their subconscious. We can trace the trajectory of those ideas. In the 18th century, we can find exactly that idea. Black people have a lower pain threshold, higher pain threshold, I should say, than white people. We can see it in the work of the English doctor Benjamin Moseley, who in the middle of the 18th century traveled to the island of Jamaica. As well as working as a doctor, he began to study the enslaved Africans who worked on those plantations, and he wrote up his dubious conclusions in a book called A Treatise on Tropical Disease and on the Climate of the West Indies. And this is one of the first places, not the first, but one of the first places in which we can see the myth which in the 21st century is influencing the actions of doctors here, the United States, and other countries where it's been studied. Moseley stated in his book that black people are, quote, void of sensibility to a surprising degree. Sensibility is just an 18th century way of saying sensitivity, in this case, to pain. They are, he said, not subject to nervous diseases. They sleep sound in every disease, no matter how ill they are, nor does any mental disturbance ever keep them awake. Moseley even argued that black people were so insensitive to pain that they could, quote, bear operations, and by that he means surgery, better than white people. He said that what would be the cause of, quote, insupportable pain to a white man, a Negro would almost disregard. And Moseley repeated a claim that was to appear in paper after paper, in book after book, in century after century, in the British Empire, the French, Belgian, Portuguese, Spanish, and the United States. The idea that he had witnessed amputation of limbs in which black people were so insensitive to pain that they could hold the upper part of the limb that was being amputated, conscious, without the need of pain relief. This myth that black people do not feel pain the way white people do from the very start was a myth that came from doctors, came from the medical establishment. Benjamin Moseley was not just a doctor, he was the Surgeon General of the island of Jamaica. That's the British Empire in the 19th century. There are dozens more examples from exactly that period. But let's leap forward to another time, another space, the 19th century, not the British Empire, but the United States. In the 1850s, a formerly enslaved man called John Brown came to Britain. And he was a man who freed himself from slavery. In the 1850s, Britain and this city, Manchester, was a place in which former enslaved African Americans could come and appeal to a nation that had abolished slavery. This was the high watermark of British anti-slavery and a British, not exactly anti-racism, but a form of support for abolition of slavery in America. Some of the great abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, Sarah Parker Remond, Ellen and William Craft, all came to Manchester to speak to abolitionist audiences, to be heard, to have their books purchased. And John Brown, like others, wrote an account of his time as an enslaved man, what we call a slave narrative. It's very like many of those hundreds of other slave narratives, apart from one passage in which John Brown describes being the subject of a medical experiment carried out by race scientists when he was enslaved in Georgia. That experiment was intended to demonstrate the mechanism for the myth that black people feel pain less than white people. The mechanism that was being proposed in the middle of the 19th century was that black people have thicker skin than white people. Again, a myth used to justify another myth. Neither are true. Let's leap forward another century to another context, the 20th century, the French colonial empire. At the beginning of the 20th century, the French racial theorist and general in the French army, Charles Mangin, wrote a book about the supposed inner nature and physical attributes, the behavioral and the physiological stereotypes he attached to people of African descent in the French colonial empire. Mangin was much more than a race theorist, much more than a plantation doctor. He was an incredibly influential figure in pre-war France. And in 1910, he wrote a book called La Force Noire, The Black Army, which helped persuade the French government to conscript black colonial soldiers into the French army to fight in a future war in Europe. And Mangin claimed in this book that one of the reasons for this, that black soldiers would be perfect soldiers in modern combat, was that they have, as he says, a disregard for pain. He wrote about lots of ethnological explanations for this, about supposedly warrior instincts, about black people's supposed predilection for violence. These are behavioral stereotypes, very old, very disturbing, very damaging. But he also wrote about the physiological stereotypes. He said that black people have underdeveloped nervous systems. That is the other explanation, the other myth to defend and perpetuate and promote the myth that black people feel pain less than white people. And when the war came in 1914, Montjean's ideas were listened to. Black soldiers were not only deployed on the Western Front, they were deployed in accordance to Montjean's theories. Black soldiers were used in the most dangerous attacks. They were used in the first wave. They were used when other units would be withdrawn because of the racial theories. And they died at a higher rate because of the ideas of race scientists, colonial experts, and people like Montjean, who decided externally about their nature and their bodies. It would be wonderful if we could draw a line under all that history. We could say this is how our ancestors thought. These are the mistakes, these are the stereotypes that used to damage the lives of people of African heritage in the past. But the problem is, as I said, this is still going on. History can explain why these ideas are so powerful. We can see these ideas operating not just in the minds of surgeons and doctors in diverse societies in Europe and in the United States. We can see how children have imbibed these stereotypes. These ideas, these physiological as well as behavioral stereotypes are so powerful that we imbibe them before we are fully grown. Children as young as 7, one study has shown, have understood these stereotypes about black bodies. A study of 2014 called Daw et al. Showed that when white and racially ethnic minority children were shown pictures of black children and white children and asked to rate how much pain each child might feel in various hypothetical scenarios, they reported that the children, not just the white children, but the black children as well, underrated the pain of the black children in those hypothetical situations. We can see something similar right in front of us, very public, literally watched by millions of people, and yet we never notice it. We've had to do studies to demonstrate it. In sports commentary, in the National Football League in America, the National Basketball League, again in the United States, but also in the British Premiership, so the English Premiership, we can see through studies that stereotypes about black people being physical, strong, athletic, perpetuate, and of them not being intellectual, strategic, and tactical also are perpetuated. One study in the National Football League showed that black players were far more likely to play in a game after a game in which they were injured than white players. They were expected to feel less pain from those injuries, to recover quickly, more quickly than white players. A piece of research carried out on the 2019-2020 Premiership season by Run Repeat, which is a think tank, and the Professional Football Association, analysed 2,073 statements made by commentators, sports commentators, and they found clear differences in the way in which players were described along the lines of race. Players with darker skin were far more likely to be described as physical attributes: strong, athletic, tough, resilient. And they were much less likely to be described in intellectual characteristics: tactical, strategic, intelligence. Again, the commentators doing this don't know they're doing this, like the doctors underprescribing pain relief don't know they're doing this. And some of the commentators and some of the doctors are themselves not white, or some of them of African heritage. These ideas about physicality, about intellect, about pain that emerged in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, the ideas that we can find in the writings of race scientists, in slave ship surgeons, in theorists like Charles Montjean, in the ideas of the slave-owning and slave-trading lobby, these ideas that were used to justify, legitimize, and defend chattel slavery and the slave trade, they're not over. They don't just belong in the past. Without understanding where these ideas come from, those clinicians who are engaged in trying to draw these ideas out of the minds of young clinicians, trainee doctors, trainee nurses, to combat the power of these stereotypes in our societies, without the knowledge of how they were built, it's far harder. This is an area of applied history where historians have an absolutely fundamental role to play. And it's one of the benefits of this process that Anindita mentions. This moment, the decolonization of history, the expansion of history, the drawing in of marginalized voices, is constantly mischaracterized and caricatured as an attack on history, an attack on Britain. This is about the expansion of history. But it's also about doing something fundamental, and you can see that looking around this room, looking around this city. The demographics of our country, the fact that we are a nation as a former imperial power that shares a big chapter of our history with the 2.5 billion people of the Commonwealth. The sheer demographics of Britain and Britain's connections with the rest of the world demand that we have a history that's fit for purpose, a history that speaks to all of us. And the version of history that I was taught, in which the First World Wars were fought only by white people, in which the Industrial Revolution had nothing to do with cotton slavery in the United States, in which all that mattered about British slavery was abolition, not slavery itself, in which the empire was about the spread of law and the building of railways. It was always dishonest. It was always full of half-truths. But fundamentally, it's now just not fit for purpose. It cannot work as a history for the nation that we are, or for a nation that would like to have, and many people believe, better relationships, more honest relationships with the 2.5 billion people with whom we share this history. Thank you very much. I've only trespassed over one of the minutes for questions, which is good for me. That's a bit of discipline, which is rare. So we still have 29 minutes for questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Destinie is going to join us as well. So if you've got any questions for either David or for Destinie, there is a roving mic that my colleague Anne-Marie has. So please put your hand up. And once the mic comes to you, first question here, you can speak. But please wait until you get the mic.
Thank you. Sorry. So, like, the internet, like apps like TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, they've been used recently to like highlight and expose social injustices. Like George Floyd, I remember, was like really big in the space of the internet. But given that it's also been used for misinformation, hate, what role do you think it will play in shaping our history, public history?
Okay, I'm going to be very pessimistic. The internet we've seen so far, the algorithms we've seen so far, are toxic and divisive, but in a way that we ain't seen nothing yet. We desperately need to find a way of controlling these technologies, shaping them, and giving them some sort of public conscious. You know, this is. We have to remember that something really, really disturbing has happened. Two things have come together. One is that we have technologies that monitor us in a way that we've never had before. Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, is the great text on this. These business models are built on two things. One is knowing us. You can see it from the adverts that pop up. You know, it knows, they know what you've looked at, they know where you've been. The addressable advertising knows if anyone in your house has looked at any product. They know, you know, if you make a purchase, that will trigger 1,000 other, you know, advertising prompts. So this system knows us really, really well, and it has learned something about human nature, which is our fault, but it's enormously to our detriment, which is that what keeps our attention is things that are extreme. If I tweet a nuanced tweet about a book I've read, it might get 300 retweets. If I get home from the pub drunk and pick a fight with a historian I don't like, and I'm a bit rude to them, it'll get 300,000. Nuance doesn't get clicks. Attention, I'm afraid the algorithms have demonstrated, are triggered by division, by extreme content, and the algorithms go from, they act like a gateway drug to more and more and more extreme content. Anger creates engagement, engagement creates clicks, and most importantly, clicks create monetization. anyone who's in the public eye, I mean, if you wanted to make more money, become more extreme. That's the answer. That's what the algorithms tell you. That's what, if you were going to sit down with somebody who understands these systems, that's the advice they would give you. Become more extreme, say more extreme stuff. And as a result, we have a growing chorus of voices in our society who monetize extremism on a platform that privileges extremism. So the internet is everything. And I think it's sometimes, we never say this at books, books, Mein Kampf is a book. Dreams of My Father's a book. We never think about, are books good or bad? They're just books and they're everything. I think it's different with these technologies because what's underlying it are algorithms. And now those algorithms are about to be expanded and their power just exponentially increased by artificial intelligence in ways that are really hard to imagine. We've just had an election in India. We've seen deep fakes. I was at an event with Maria Ressa yesterday, who's a journalist who's been fighting in the Philippines against the Duterte regime. There are clips of her appearing on American chat shows saying how much money she earned from her activism, and they're not real. They're totally convincing. She never has set foot on those studios. She's never sat in a room with Jimmy Fallon or any of the rest of them, but they're 100% believable. We are, if we're lucky years, if we're unlucky months away from not ever being able to know if a voice we hear on television or a voice we hear in our phone is a real person or the person that we're thinking it is. So we ain't seen nothing yet. Sorry, not very optimistic.
Okay, so you talked a lot about education and the curriculum in terms of what's not there and some things that you think that should be there, but I'd also like to talk about critical race theory. So what are your kind of ideas on that? Do you support it? Do you think that maybe it should be brought to the UK? What are your kind of thoughts on that?
I'm not very interested in critical race theory. But what I am interested in is how my lack of interest is invisible in these public debates. I'm a historian. I'm an old-fashioned empirical historian. I'm not a theoretical historian. I read theory. I struggle with it. It doesn't enormously influence my work. But what's interesting is the way in which critical race theory, which, let's remember, is a form of legal studies, jurisprudence. It's a quite small field in legal studies, only really in American universities. It's been to some degree influential outside, but many of the ideas attributed to critical race theory, like the idea that race is systemic, predated. Malcolm X talked about race being systemic. So what's interesting about critical race theory, in my view, is not so much critical race theory. My apologies to critical race theorists who love it. It's the way in which it's been weaponized. It is almost certain that the election in Virginia 2 years ago was won by the Republicans by weaponizing the fears that people have, illegitimate fears about critical race theory, creating those fears. People have been very open about the way in which they've taken this form of black scholarship and made it sound frightening, to frighten white voters and to make them vote in the ways that they choose. And it is coming here. So I've had very respected historians like David Abufala who have written in public, in newspapers, that I'm a historian who's influenced by critical race theory. Now, these are historians who, like myself, pride themselves on sources. You don't say anything without a source. And yet, very serious historians have said this about me without being able to cite a single quotation, a single citation in any book or paper I've ever written to a critical race theorist. Not because I'm terribly opposed to critical race theory, but it's not the work I do. They do it because it's lazy, because this is a way of delegitimizing black people. It's like the word Destinie used to describe herself. I could never use that word and would never use that word, which is activist. Because black scholars are being, the word activist is a way of delegitimizing black scholarship. People say black people are activists when they're academics as a way of making them sound frightening and delegitimizing their work and saying that they have none of the scholarly detachment expected of white people. So all of these terms and the way that they're deployed and the way that they're used are part of a culture war attack on black scholarship. And again, being a historian is useful because this is normal. As Destinie will have studied in her work, every form of black scholarship, every form of black resistance, every black movement, every black leader is said to be illegitimate. Whether it's taking the knee in the 2020s, the Black Power salute in the 1960s, the NAACP in the 1920s, the marches for black recognition after the First World War in 1919. No matter what it is, it's illegitimate. Black people somehow are always listening to the wrong leaders, doing the wrong symbols, writing the wrong scholarship. I don't know what it is, but for some reason we always seem to be asking for justice in a way that there are white people are happy to say that we're just doing it wrong. It's not that they're racist, no, you understand. It's that we're just asking for equality incorrectly. We need to recognize this for what it is. This is the game plan for delegitimizing black scholarship and making people fearful of parts of history that we all share. Black history and imperial history and British history, they're shared histories. So we need to reject the ways in which these ideas are made to sound frightening. Destiny, you must have had this.
Yeah, I was going to just add, with a lot of the work that I do, completely agree. All of these black scholars, activists, community leaders are always vilified by the mainstream media. So I look a lot at the 1981 uprisings in Moss Side, and constantly every single leading figure is criminalised by the state. What I find really interesting in the work that I do is looking at the diverse forms of resistance, whether it's taking to the streets or writing a paper, setting up a supplementary school. There are so many different ways to look at the black struggle, which isn't asking for justice, it's demanding justice, and that's what kind of I focus on, what I'm super interested by.
So, first off, I find you incredibly inspirational. I just want to put that out there. I'm sure lots of
Thank you very much.
But I've watched one of your documentaries, and I remember seeing that, I think it was like the Georgian era, that there was sort of a myth that after sort of slavery was abolished, that sort of black people were sort of free and treated equally. And there was sort of, I just remember, I was quite young when I watched this, but I remember there was just a portrait of sort of a black person, a child, I think, working in a white people's house. And I just kind of wondered, when did the myths start? Like, what was the first sort of myth that, because you've talked a lot about myths and rewriting history, I wondered what the first one is, do you think?
Well, I think it's really interesting to look at writings about, there were writings about people from other parts of the world, but I'm interested in people of African descent and black history. That's my specialism. If you look at the writings that take place in Britain when the first British navigators and sailors managed to get round the kind of big lump at the top of Africa and get to West Africa, round the Sahara basically, and have direct contact with people of sub-Saharan African heritage. Remember, in the 9th century, Islam moved along North Africa, and contact between West Africans and Europeans was sort of blocked off by the Sahara and the power of the North African kingdoms. So it's a really kind of middle of the 16th century, 1540s, 1550s, black people turn up in Britain. And the writings, remember this is the Tudor era, this is Shakespeare. The writings of that period show an amazing fascination in human physical difference. Now, it's not race, and I don't use the word race at this point. Race is an incredibly complicated term to use, but it is human physical difference. The English are absolutely fascinated by why people are black. We look so incredibly different as a people. I remember when I was a student, I went traveling to northern Sudan. I remember walking to a market in a place where the average height of people was 6'6". I'm 6'1", and it was, these people are so beautiful. It was hard to believe that we were the same species. So we do look very different, and it is fascinating. And they're in an age before race as a systemic form of thinking, and they're just trying to make sense of this. They know Africa's hot, and the people who have come off these ships, who've landed in London, have dark skin, and they will say, well, is this the effect of the sun? Has the sun kind of made these people dark? White people go brown in the sun. Maybe this is an extreme version of that. And then they wonder, well, I wonder whether black people are white when they're born. And then, of course, mixed race children appear and they're brown. And there are all of these debates about the nature of the cause of human physical difference. But what there aren't in the 16th century are the stereotypes which we all know today. The ideas that black people are hypersexual, the ideas that black people have a predilection to crime, the myth that black people are unindustrious, slow to work, the idea that black people don't feel pain. All of these stereotypes don't yet exist. You don't see them in that 16th century writing. And what's important to remember is that because these ideas were built, they were constructed, and they were constructed in the age of slavery that was yet to come. So what we see is a trajectory of these stereotypes and these myths slowly growing and developing. And not in some organic process, but because slavery demands them. The idea of chattel slavery, of creating societies that are slave societies, where to be black is to be enslaved, is to white is to be free, where to be black is to be a piece of property. To create an idea that convinces human beings to see other human beings and somehow not see them as human beings is an incredibly powerful idea. It takes laws, it takes propaganda, it takes the pseudoscience of doctors like Benjamin Moseley, who I mentioned, and many thousands of others, and it takes centuries to develop these ideas. The positive you can take from our history, and the thing that's often missed in the cultural war debates about our history, is there were always people who rejected this. Now, they often rejected it in ways that we wouldn't be comfortable with. Some of the great anti-slavery heroes still regurgitate racial myths. Granville Sharp, pivotal figure in British history in beginning the abolitionist movement, still believes all sorts of biblical scriptural nonsense about black people. But there was always opposition to it. Problem is that I think, as I was saying earlier, we've got to a point where we have begun to recover the lost voices of lost communities. What we haven't really hardwired into our national conversation is something even more uncomfortable, which is the trajectory of where these ideas came from and how they were evolved. And that's a story that has moments when you do hear pan-humanist, anti-racist, well, not quite anti-racist, but less racist ideas about human equality, very often with black people needing to go on a journey to become equal in a real sense. But you also hear the biological racism I spoke about earlier. So it's this cacophony of voices, but there were always people who questioned these ideas. There's never this, we often hear that when you talk about these things, you're judging the past to the standards of our time. Well, there were people at the time who thought in ways much closer to the way that we tend to think these days.
I was just going to add as well, so I've just finished a project with Global Threads looking at Manchester's connection to the slave trade, and I looked at Edisto Island, which is a sea island just off South Carolina. And again, because my work heavily revolves around resistance, I looked into the actual families who were, or the people and communities that were picking the cotton that was shipped here to Manchester and then sold at the Royal Exchange. If anyone's interested, it's the McConnell and Kennedys. And I think that's a really important element of it. We learn about, I remember being at school learning about slavery so superficially and hearing about black trauma and pain. But as David was saying, you never hear about the diverse forms of resistance, these community, minority voices, and slowly the work that's being done by scholars across the country is slowly unearthing these hidden histories and amplifying their voices to get a broader understanding of this period. And just also one more thing, reading against the grain is so important. Throughout my degree, I've seen so many really interesting pictures perpetuating these colonial fantasies and myths about black people. And reading against the grain is what allows you to kind of delve into the scientific racism that rooted these beliefs and expanded them across the imperialist world.
I was just going to ask, you said that from beginning of time people were being erased from history and silenced forcibly. To time now, people are still being silenced. Why do you think it was done from the start and is still going on now?
for the work that I've been doing, so I look a lot at the erasure of voices in contemporary society. But I'd say I'm an anti-racist activist and wannabe scholar, emerging scholar perhaps. But there's this system, as Dave was talking about earlier, you see when you look further and further back, these physical differences, which then develop these colonial fantasies and ideologies that have developed over time, and we do see this trajectory. And those voices aren't the mainstream voices, because it's the voices of the oppressed. The oppressed are always, historically, have been silenced continually by the mainstream narratives. But then also there's a question of where are these narratives kept? A lot of the, so when I mentioned Edisto Island before, they have these Gullah traditions which come from rice growing regions in West Africa prior to slavery. And most of their traditions are oral traditions that were passed down through families and generations. If you look at colonial offices and the tangible archives that we have now, the majority of them from imperialist countries and colonizers are written down. But then you see the same thing in contemporary society. In Moss Side, the youth movement was insane. It was massive. Young people heavily relied on youth centres and youth clubs and things like that. But there aren't any resources on it. But then if you were to look at perhaps the government's analysis of youth work across the country, you could potentially find something. So I think there's a question of the sources that have been used, but also just the nature of the oppressor and the oppressed.
When discussing Black history, why do you think the history generally starts from colonialization, not what was happening in Black countries like Africa before the Europeans arrived?
I mean, of course, it's not my subject, though. I mean, I'm Nigerian. Nigeria has a history. I'm interested in that as much as I'm interested in the history of my other country, Britain. But I'm interested in the age of empire. So I'm interested in what happens when a few handful of technologies allow Europeans to expand across oceans in the 16th and 17th centuries. That's what I'm interested in. And I think there's a risk that we think that we automatically think that the study of that era is a way of repeating the myths that are put forward in the 18th and 19th century, that Africa doesn't have a history. Of course it does, it's just not what I study.
I would just like to quickly add, you can see more and more academics writing about this history. So I went to Professor Hakeem Adi's talk a couple months ago, and he looks at the history of Africa in a lot of depth. He had an amazing course at the university, is it Winchester?
Chichester. But I mean, there's a lot of, the great African historians are obviously Africans. There's, most of my siblings studied at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, and they studied Nigerian history as much as you'd study British history in Manchester. So, the study of imperialism doesn't negate the histories of those nations before imperialism, nor does it negate the histories of those nations since.
Thank you. A question for Destiny, please, if I may. Thank you for speaking this morning. You're clearly a talented and passionate historian. A lot of the students here may be doing their own coursework. You mentioned you're doing your mini dissertation. I wonder if you could give us an insight as a historian and a scholar, the challenges you face finding that evidence you need, finding that piece of gold, that piece of primary evidence that you will use to prove a theory or change your mind, your opinions, and how maybe as a historian you overcome those challenges, please.
I'm not sure how it works in you guys in school. So when I was at A-level, I had a fixed topic, a fixed question. So I had to use, I was mainly using resources online. With the nature of what I study at the moment, specifically when it pertains to inner city Britain, I have to go into the archives. So I spent ages at the Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Race archives, looking at the Eloise Edwards collection. My question was really niche, and some of the things that I looked at, not many scholars have looked at. So specifically with the youth work, it was just pictures that weren't dated, there wasn't a name of the photographer, And there was just one that I was really interested in. It was a picture of Hideaway Youth Club, and it's massive. It took up so much space. It had a really beautifully painted like mural of Africa, and it said Hideaway across the side. And I just analysed it. It's such a like small thing, but it was interesting, and I enjoyed it. And there was other pictures and bits and bobs like that. So I just ingrained myself, jumped into the archives, spent time with the community, but also used the online resources. There's not much secondary scholarship on what I look at, so it's been a little bit more challenging. But in other modules that I've done at uni, things like JSTOR or even contemporary news articles, because I think, especially when you're researching modern Britain, 20th century Britain, it's quite easy to make those connections. So yeah, both in person and online archives, they're very useful.
Okay, so with what you guys both do, so obviously it's a very sensitive subject, and there are going to be people that like will give backlash that may not agree with certain themes. So I'd just like to ask for both of you, what has been your biggest challenge in terms of with your work, producing the ideas that you feel are correct? Like, what's been the biggest like obstacle and the biggest challenges that you've had to face, and how you've had to overcome them?
I don't know. I don't really I feel very fortunate. I'm sure there's obstacles. I'm a quite combative person, and I'm sure that helps. I quite like fighting for what I do. So I don't know. I tend to steamroll over things. So I probably don't notice them as much as I should do.
For me, because of what I write on, I'm not from Moss Side. The only real connection that I have, like personal connection to my topic, is the fact that I'm black and I write on black people on Moss Side. So I get I think writing my mini dissertation, I was very, very, very scared that I wasn't accurately presenting the real lives and the authentic community bonds, relationships, conflicts within Moss Side. And there's a lot of inter-community discourse that continues till today. And the way that I combated that was just by ingraining myself in the community, asserting what I think, or having my position and trying to situate it within this wider discourse.
Hello, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for your time today, but I just wanted to touch upon the broader concern that we have about information and how we get that delivered in an age of social media, as well as bridging the gap between academia and scholarship. So for both of you, I'm just curious to know where you feel we're able, or how we're able to bridge the gap between information that's accessible to ordinary folks, that's not always just stuck in universities, but also something that is still rigorous and deliverable to young people, in your opinions.
Well, for me, it's always been David. So I'm 20, so I'm still quite young. And I remember being in school, I'm staying on the way here, when I was in A-levels for English literature, we read Black and British. It was this really exciting experience. But the documentaries, I love documentaries, videos, like YouTube videos. It might not always be accurate, and I think when it's I look for oral histories a lot and oral testimonies, so things like YouTube videos about a certain area or a certain time are super useful. But also journalist articles. I know you've worked on like the Cotton Capital stuff with The Guardian. I think that's a really accessible way of receiving this history. A lot of the projects that I'm working on at the moment are based in museums or art galleries, providing research to inform projects that can get this hidden history out to a broader audience. So I think that's what I would say. It's quite important.
I'll be brief because I know we're short of time. I think the problem is that for the most part, information is behind, well, not for the most part, to a large extent, information is behind paywalls. Misinformation is free. That's the fundamental problem with the business model of information on the internet. verified information by journalists and scholars in a way that I think is truly shocking when it comes to academic papers is restricted and rationed according to ability to pay. Misinformation is always free. One of the reasons why, you know, I write for The Guardian, I sit on the board of The Guardian, and I think The Guardian's our most important newspaper, is because, you know, we could put up a paywall. We've done the modelling, we know how much money we'd make. There's no point being The Guardian if we have a paywall. The reason why The Guardian has confronted its history, founded in 1822 by 11 men, 9 of whom were brokers in slave-produced cotton, 1 of whom owned enslaved people. The reason why we've been open about this, the reason why there's a vast body of information online, 2 academic reports, more to come, is because we should, because we're capable of doing it. But, you know, until we don't have a business model that supports journalism, we haven't found a way of allowing journalism to exist online the way it did in print. And I think we're in very, very serious difficulty as a society. And that is even before the fact that an algorithm would be able to write a fake page, put a fake picture and a fake interview into a page in seconds, 1 million times a day in, you know, 18 months, 2 years. We are entering a world where, as I said, we ain't seen nothing yet, with no protocols, no way of actually supporting journalism, and at a time when this year more journalists have been killed than any year since 2015. I think we're in very, very serious trouble unless we can find a way of using government to force certain online companies to think about the civic and civilizational good as well as their bottom line. I think, you know, those companies know who they are. It's not all of the tech companies by any means, but it is some of them. If their business model is based on division, I think they're inimical to the workings of liberal democracy. And I think that's, I fear, the lesson we're about to find out as we literally almost by the day forget the Second World War because of the loss of that generation. Not the most upbeat of answers, but being honest.
I think sadly we've run out of the question times now. We'll wrap it up here. We do have a last thank you, I think.
Yeah, okay. So on behalf of Factory International, just would like to give a massive thank you and a round of applause and a show of appreciation for our 2 brilliant speakers.
Well done.